You're sitting in a meeting. Someone across the table yawns, and within about 4 seconds, without deciding to, without wanting to, you yawn too. Not because you're tired, not because the meeting is boring, although let's be honest, it probably is. You yawn because you watched someone else yawn, and if you're reading this right now, there's a decent chance you're already fighting one off. That's not a coincidence, that's not a joke, that's one of the strangest, most involuntary things your brain does, and almost nobody can explain why. Think about how bizarre this actually is. You didn't choose it. You couldn't stop it even if you tried, not really. Someone across a room, someone on your phone screen, someone in a photograph, sometimes even reading the word yawn enough times, and your jaw starts to ache for it. Your body has hijacked itself on behalf of a complete stranger's face. And this isn't rare. This isn't some fringe reflex a handful of people experience. Somewhere between 40 and 60% of people yawn in response to seeing someone else yawn, and the number gets even stranger the closer you look. So what is actually happening here? Why does a yawn spread like that? Like some kind of biological chain reaction nobody agreed to participate in? Let's go. Start with the obvious question. Isn't a yawn just about being tired or needing oxygen? That's the assumption almost everyone carries around, and it turns out to be mostly wrong. For decades, the leading theory was that yawning pulls in extra oxygen when your blood oxygen dips. A kind of built-in reset button. It's a clean, tidy explanation. It's also been tested directly, and it falls apart almost immediately. Researchers had participants breathe air with elevated oxygen and reduced oxygen levels and measured yawn frequency. If the oxygen theory were correct, low oxygen should have triggered more yawning and high oxygen should have suppressed it. Neither happened. Yawn rates stayed essentially flat regardless of what was in the air. Whatever a yawn is doing, it isn't primarily about gas exchange. So scientists went looking elsewhere, and what they found is genuinely stranger than a simple oxygen fix. The dominant theory now centers on brain temperature. Your brain, like the rest of your body, needs to stay within a fairly narrow temperature range to function properly, and it generates a significant amount of heat just by being active. A yawn, that huge open-mouth stretch, does something mechanically unusual. It increases blood flow to the face and skull, stretches the jaw, and pulls in a large rush of air that cools the blood flowing to your brain. Researchers testing this applied cold packs to people's foreheads and found yawn frequency dropped. They had people breathe through their nose only, which cools incoming air more efficiently than mouth breathing, and yawn rates also dropped. The pattern held up experiment after experiment. Yawning looks less like a request for oxygen and more like your brain running a cooling cycle, an actual thermal regulation event happening through your face. But none of that explains the contagious part. Knowing why you yawn on your own doesn't tell you why someone else's yawn makes you do it too. And this is where things stop being about biology and start being about something much stranger, something almost social. Here's the detail that changes the whole conversation. Contagious yawning isn't universal in the animal kingdom, and where it does show up, it shows up almost exclusively in socially complex species. Chimpanzees yawn contagiously, so do bonobos, so do dogs, and this one is particularly interesting because dogs have been documented yawning in response to human yawns specifically, not just other dogs. A study out of the UK found that dogs were significantly more likely to yawn after watching a familiar human yawn than after watching that same person just open their mouth without yawning. Wolves, dogs' closest wild relative, show contagious yawning too, but almost exclusively between animals with strong social bonds, not with unfamiliar wolves. Meanwhile, species that don't form complex social groups, most reptiles for instance, either don't yawn contagiously at all or show no measurable pattern connected to social closeness. The animals that catch yawns from each other are, almost without exception, the animals that live in groups, read each other's faces, and depend on social coordination to survive. That's the thread researchers eventually pulled on, and it leads somewhere genuinely fascinating: empathy. Multiple studies have found that susceptibility to contagious yawning correlates with empathic ability in humans. People who score higher on empathy assessments are statistically more likely to catch a yawn from someone else. Brain imaging backs this up. When researchers put people in fMRI scanners and showed them videos of others yawning, the areas that lit up weren't just the motor regions controlling jaw movement. Activity also appeared in regions associated with social cognition and understanding other people's mental and emotional states, the same neural circuitry involved in reading facial expressions and modeling what someone else might be thinking or feeling. Your brain, when it watches someone yawn, isn't just registering a physical action. It's running a small simulation of that person's internal state, and your body is completing the loop on their behalf. And this is where the social closeness data gets almost eerie. A study led by researchers investigating contagious yawning found that people were significantly more likely to catch a yawn from a family member or close friend than from an acquaintance, and more likely to catch it from an acquaintance than from a complete stranger. The effect scaled directly with emotional closeness. Yawn contagion, in other words, isn't a random glitch. It's graded by relationship. Your body yawns more for the people it's most bonded to, which suggests contagious yawning might function as a kind of unconscious social signal, a physical marker of connection that operates entirely below conscious awareness. There's also an age pattern that makes this even more compelling. Contagious yawning essentially doesn't exist in very young children. Studies tracking child development have found that susceptibility to catching a yawn from someone else typically doesn't appear in a reliable way until around age 4, and it climbs steadily through childhood as the brain regions responsible for theory of mind, the ability to understand that other people have separate thoughts, feelings, and perspectives, continue developing. Interestingly, some research on children on the autism spectrum has found reduced rates of contagious yawning, though findings across studies vary, and researchers are careful not to overstate the connection. Still, the general pattern lines up with the empathy theory almost too well. Contagious yawning appears to switch on at roughly the same developmental stage as the cognitive machinery required to understand other minds, and it appears to be muted in populations where that machinery works differently. That's not proof of a direct causal link, but it's a striking coincidence if it is one. Now, here's the part that tends to surprise people the most. Yawn contagion doesn't require you to actually see someone yawn with your own eyes in real time. Reading the word yawn repeatedly, like you might be experiencing right now, can trigger it. Looking at a photograph of a yawning face can trigger it. Even thinking deliberately about yawning has been shown in lab settings to increase yawn frequency in participants. Your brain doesn't need direct sensory confirmation, it just needs the concept activated and the body follows. That's an unusually powerful level of influence for something you have almost no conscious control over. So why would evolution build something like this? Why wire an involuntary physical reflex directly into the machinery of social bonding? The leading explanation connects back to group coordination. In social species, especially ones that rest, sleep, or transition activity levels together, there's a real survival advantage to synchronizing arousal states. If one member of a group starts to feel drowsy or is signaling a shift toward rest, and that state spreads rapidly through yawning to the rest of the whole group can transition together. Everyone stays alert together, or everyone winds down together, rather than half the group being asleep, while the other half remains vigilant and mismatched with the group's collective needs. Some researchers studying baboons have found evidence supporting exactly this. Yawning appeared to spread through groups in ways correlated with shifts in collective activity level, functioning almost like a synchronization signal, a way of keeping a social group's internal clocks lined up without anyone saying a word. There's a version of this that shows up constantly in modern life too, even though most people never connect it to ancient group survival. Yawning spreads through classrooms, it spreads through offices, it spreads through waiting rooms full of complete strangers who share nothing except physical proximity for 20 minutes. You might assume that's just boredom, and boredom is certainly part of the picture. Low arousal states do increase yawning generally, but the contagious spread specifically. One yawn triggering a wave of yawns across a room of people who barely know each other only really makes sense if you accept that some ancient piece of your social wiring is still active, still trying to synchronize the group.
even when the group is just people waiting for a dentist appointment. Let's address the myth that tends to attach itself to all of this because it's almost too tempting not to believe. You'll often hear that yawning is contagious because it's a sign of rudeness or boredom being
silently transmitted, some kind of social criticism passed face to face. That's not really supported by the evidence. Contagious yawning correlates with closeness and empathic connection, not disrespect. If anything, the data suggests the opposite interpretation. You're statistically more likely to catch a yawn from people you're bonded to than from people you're indifferent toward. Catching someone's yawn isn't your body calling them boring, it's your nervous system quietly registering that you're paying close attention to them, closely enough that your own physiology is responding to theirs in real time. Here's something else worth sitting with because it complicates the tidy version of this story. Not everyone is susceptible to contagious yawning, and it's not simply a matter of empathy levels alone. Research has found that individual variation is significant. Some people almost never catch a yawn from others, regardless of social closeness, and this doesn't necessarily mean anything is wrong.